Welcome everyone. I am Tim Shelberg from Gordon Thomas Honeywell, and it is such a pleasure to be delivering the 5th annual DNA Hit of the Year presentation during the Amazing Hits Conference. The DNA Hit of the Year program is truly an international collaboration that is able to share, through real cases, the value of DNA databases on a global scale. During the first 4 years, the cases the judges selected as the DNA Hit of the Year opened our eyes to what's possible when the advancement of science is combined with the tenacity of DNA scientists and police officers. Let's take a quick look at these 4 cases. In 2017, the judges selected an Italian case, the murder of Yara Gambriasio. Who could forget this high-profile, wild, and dramatic murder mystery that unfolded in northern Italy and was covered by the global press? Yara, just 13 years old at the time, was attacked and senselessly murdered as she walked home from a gymnastics practice. A full DNA STR profile was found on Yara's body, but at the time the Italians did not have a national criminal offender DNA database to compare the sample to. That didn't stop the Italian authorities. They created the world's largest mass screen ever conducted and collected 15,000 DNA profiles, including YSTRs. Eventually, this massive task led to a YSTR match. The YSTR match gave the police what they needed to lock in on one deceased individual. And after further testing, the DNA suggested the killer must be one of his 3 male children. But the STRs did not match any of them. The police quickly realized that there must be a secret child that neither the family or the community knew about. So, in an attempt to identify the mother of the killer, the police moved to create a second DNA mass screen of 500 women that could have been the mistress of the deceased father. Finally, they found her sons, and were able to identify the killer and bring closure to this long, dramatic murder mystery. In 2018, the judges selected a United Kingdom case, the 1984 sexual assault and murder of Melanie Road. This was an extremely sad case of a young woman that was attacked while walking home after a night out with friends. Melanie fought hard during the assault, cutting the killer. This allowed the police to find the killer's blood at the crime scene, which set up the focus of a grueling 30-year-old hunt for the killer. As DNA database developed in the United Kingdom in the 1990s, police searched the database routinely, but never received a match. But the United Kingdom is one of the progressive countries that allows for familial searching. As fate would have it, the killer's daughter was arrested, but not convicted, of a very minor offense of shoving her flatmate. As a result, she was added to the DNA database. When a familial search was next conducted, the crime scene DNA from Melanie's murder hit to the daughter of a potential relative of the killer. After a quick investigation, the police confirmed that the crime scene DNA belonged to her father, and justice was served. The police in this case were the true champions, a 30-year commitment where they never gave up. But let's also recognize the unsung hero, the British Parliament. Without them allowing for familial searching and creating a database law that includes arrestees from minor crimes, this case would still be unsolved. A reminder of the importance your laws play in solving cases with DNA. In 2019, the judges selected a US case, the Golden State serial murder and rapist case. Between 1973 and 1986, the Golden State Killer terrorized California by committing over 50 sadistic and torturous rapes and 13 homicides. The killer left no traces with the exception of his DNA, which would eventually be profiled and searched against government DNA databases without ever any results. With 40 years of investigation and no likely suspects, the Golden State Killer developed a reputation as the most significant unsolved serial murder case in US history. The luck changed on this case with the advent of genetic genealogy, when a criminalist from California had the idea to search the crime scene DNA against public genetic genealogy databases. As you all know by now, this led to a match to a distant relative, which in turn allowed genealogists to ultimately find the Golden State Killer. Not only was it global news to solve one of the greatest murder mysteries in U.S. history, but this case set off a mad dash throughout police departments across the country to use genetic genealogy to solve hundreds of unsolved homicides in a very short period of time. This case showed us that solving crime with DNA does not always have to be about using traditional databases. There are Plan B DNA database approaches that can work. It also begs the question of what laws and privacy standards do we need to utilize genetic genealogy in an effective but ethical manner. In 2020, the judges selected a case from Paraguay and Brazil, the 2017 robbery of the century. While the crime was committed in Paraguay, the estimated 50 criminals that committed the crime were Brazilian, and most of the criminal investigation, including all of the crime lab work, was processed by the Brazilian Federal Police. If there was ever a case in the Hit of the Year program that felt like a movie script, this was it. Imagine 50 heavily armed assailants with armored vehicles racing through a town towards a bank, blowing up that bank to steal millions from a vault, and engaging in a 3-hour shootout with police. There was literally destruction everywhere. When the smoke cleared, the Brazilian Federal Police DNA lab had its work cut out for them. 450 pieces of DNA evidence needed testing. Touch DNA from vehicles, boats, weapons, explosives, and blood from many of the wounded assailants. After some long days in the DNA lab, they were able to develop 47 separate profiles from criminals that participated in the crime. When the 47 profiles were placed into the Brazilian DNA database, there were many hits to serious previously committed unsolved crimes. What's more, every few months, another criminal from the bank heist is convicted of another crime, placed into the national database, and linked back to the bank heist. The robbery of the century was a major crime that took a major effort by the Brazilian Federal Police Lab to bring this criminal gang to justice. As you are reminded when hearing the facts of these cases and role DNA played in solving them, you can understand why the judges selected them as the hit of the year. The top case selected each year is certainly a key part of the Hit of the Year program. However, to me, the Hit of the Year program is so much more than the top case. It's about the hundreds of cases submitted that we will all collectively learn from. So this year, due to the pandemic, we decided not to ask for new cases to be submitted for review. Rather, we are going to take a deeper look at some of the cases that were not selected as the top case in the past. We have assembled a talented and committed panel to help share these cases. This panel is made up of previous Hit of the Year judges, as well as crime lab and police personnel that worked on some of the cases we will be discussing today. Our first speaker today is retired Alameda County, California, USA, Deputy Prosecutor Rock Harmon. For those of you who don't know Rock, he was an early trailblazer on how to get DNA introduced and admissible through the courts in the 1990s. A key figure in what is known as the DNA wars in the American judicial system, his work helped pave the way for what we and the courts now take for granted when it comes to DNA admissibility. Before I turn the presentation over to Rock, let me say a few words about the role judges for the Hit of the Year program play and how Rock helped with this process. Most of you know that we select new judges each year for the program. This keeps the discussion of selecting the Hit of the Year lively and adds new perspectives. I say this with one exception, that being Rock Harmon, who serves as an automatic judge each year. When we started the program, I needed a partner that would help me develop the program and achieve the goals we were looking to create. Thank you, Rock, for your energy and your dedication to the DNA Hit of the Year. Over to you.
Hi, Tim. Thanks for inviting me to be a participant and a judge again in the Hit of the Year. The kinds of cases submitted for consideration as Hit of the Year have changed over the years as the science and protocols have changed. In 2019, the judges met to discuss the finalist cases. This was the year the Golden State Killer case was submitted as a case for consideration. It was an amazing case in that it introduced the world to genetic genealogy as a means to solve horrible crimes. I think most of the judges that year wondered why we were meeting to rank the cases, as Golden State Killer was clearly going to be selected as the top case. But we had a judge that I will say was a purist. It was her opinion that the hit of the year should be from a government database, not a non-government database like genetic genealogy uses. So we had a lively discussion. It was fascinating to hear all the opinions from representatives from around the world on this matter. Along these same lines, one observation I have from being a judge for the Hit of the Year program is how creative and determined the police and crime labs around the world are to find answers using DNA. They're always looking for the next DNA strategy. Over the years, many of the top-rated submissions, and if you look back on what Tim described with the case from Italy, they demonstrated extremely complicated, long-term investigations using various DNA tools and frequent interactions between the lab and the investigators to help further the investigation. Genetic genealogy has provided yet another means to solve cases to supplement the cold hits produced by our offender databases. In addition, familial searching provides a similar hope that unsolved cases may be solved based on an entirely separate premise. An early, highly regarded submission, the 32-year-old Melanie Road murder case from Bath, United Kingdom, is a wonderful example of a successful familial search. In order to provide every opportunity to solve cold cases, we must evaluate and embrace the policies and processes from countries like the US and the UK that are successfully using familial searching while also protecting individual privacy rights. The most recent country to embrace familial searching, Sweden, used it on a 1995 case that was part of the 2020 Hit of the Year program. In this case, an 8-year-old girl was abducted and sexually assaulted in a small coastal town in Sweden as she was riding her bike to school. It baffled the police for 25 years. Then, the moment the government authorized and introduced familial searching, they hit on the suspect and closed the case. This is why we need familial searching. We're fortunate to have Christina Wyden with us today. She is the CODIS administrator from the Swedish National Forensic Center, and she's going to tell us about what it meant to solve this case and what familial searching has meant to Swedish crime fighting.
Thank you, Rock, and thank you for having me. Yes, this has been a long case in Sweden. The crime was committed in 1995 already. By then, we didn't have any DNA database. We didn't do any DNA analysis either. The case was kept for the future because we knew about that the DNA technology would develop. And in 1999 and also later in 2003, a DNA sample was taken from the T-shirt of the girl. We can have a DNA profile from the stain from the T-shirt. And this case has involved many people, many policemen, many investigators, many colleagues of mine here at the lab. And finally, in 2019, this was the first case to be solved by using familial searching. And of course, this was a great feeling when we realized that we could solve the case using familial searching. For the community in Sweden, solving this case has been also very fantastic. And for the girl, of course, good to have this case solved. We have had many questions about how we solved the case, and much interest has been put on using the DNA database also with the tool familial searching. In 2019, it became legal to do familial searches, and the lab before that, we knew that the law going to be legal. So the lab in advance put together a best practice or how to do this. And we found out that we should do familial searching for the most severe crimes, or if we have a very serial crime, we will not do it with any crime. And we also have made good tests, so we knew what we were doing, and we also report good ranked lists to put to the police, also educated the police so they knew what they would expect from the list, from the family search that we were giving them. During the years, the sample taken from this case has been profiled several times. Finally, then it was the family search that made us solve the case. And I had a remark about that in Sweden. We're not allowed to save the reference samples. We can save them for up to 6 months. For us in the lab, meaning that we cannot do the YSTR analysis. The workload for us at the lab is less, but for the police, it is more work to do to go through a longer list and evaluate the candidates. Yeah, but in this case, certain case with a little girl with a rape case from 95, when we did this family search, we had only 5 candidates because we have some rules. We don't send the police the whole database ranked. We report all the top candidates that have a likelihood reach more than 300 to be a close relative. And in this certain case, only 5 persons in the database proved to be able to be a parent or child to the sample. And in this case, the top candidate happens to be the son of the perpetrator.
Thank you, Christina. Obviously a fantastic outcome in this case. And again, I have to hand it to the Swedish government that by permitting familial searching made solving this case possible. When it comes to forensic DNA, I am always reminded how much power our government leaders and elected officials have over what crimes get solved. They decide through legislation which criminals go into the database and whether processes like familial searching are permitted. These decisions not only decide who gets caught, but also comes with the heavy burden of knowing if they fail to act, it means another day that a violent criminal remains in the community and able to harm others. People often ask me, what are some of the cases that have stuck with you from the Hit of the Year program? Well, the 4 cases that the judges selected as the Hit of the Year are certainly always on top of mind. But with over 300 cases submitted over the last 4 years, you can imagine there are many others. But I do want to mention a few. One of the cases I often think about is the serial rapist case from the Cape Town region of South Africa. In this case, the offender raped over 30 women in and around Cape Town between 2011 and 2016. What the offender did not realize when he was committing these horrible crimes was that the government of South Africa was building both a robust criminal offender and casework national database. During this time, they were putting the DNA from the 30 sexual assault kits into the database. Of course, this meant that they knew that they were dealing with a serial rapist, but they did not have a suspect. The offender was eventually convicted and placed into the database for an unrelated crime. And when it was entered, it hit 25 serial rapes at one time. This was probably the most hits ever recorded on one offender anywhere in the world. I always wonder what it was like to see that many hits in just an instant. Well, we are fortunate today to have a person whose department did see that many hits with a single offender. I have the pleasure of introducing Philippa Webb. Philippa is a retired reporting officer within the DNA unit of the South African Police. Philippa, we're looking forward to hearing your perspective on what it meant to working on such a significant case that brought closure to so many victims when it was solved.
Thanks, Tim. It's such a privilege to be on the panel today and to be discussing the State versus Sikangele Mkhize case in Cape Town, South Africa. This was a watershed case for the South African DNA database because a convicted offender's DNA sample was now loaded onto the convicted offenders index. These samples are then compared to samples on the crime scene index from DNA profiles from crime scene samples. In 2013, Mkhize was arrested on a common assault charge and spent 11 months in prison after he pleaded guilty. His DNA sample was taken during this time and added to the convicted offenders index. His DNA profile was then run against intelligence cases. In South Africa, we refer to intelligence cases as crime cases where there's no suspect. Crime scene samples have been taken, and these are loaded onto the database as well, under a separate index known as the crime scene index. Mki's reference sample was then run against these samples, and to our surprise, shock, and elation, his profile hit with 30 other cases. I was a writing reporting officer at the time, and I was classifying intelligence cases between cases that gave us results and cases that didn't. And when I found that these 30 cases had the same male DNA profile, we were absolutely surprised. My colleagues and I couldn't believe that after 5 years, so between 2011 and 2016, we were finally able to link a reference sample to so many cases. We were able to link him via a full DNA profile. There were no mixtures that were investigated any further. And so his male DNA profile was directly linked to these 30 cases. During the time span that he was on his rampage within Cape Town, the community was infuriated by the fact that a serial rapist was on the loose. In those 4 or 5 years that he was committing crimes, the community took the law into their own hands, and over that time period, killed 4 men in vigilante killings. This was obviously very shocking and could have been prevented had his DNA sample been taken initially and run in 2011. But at the same time, we were so pleased that we were able to get a match instead of never being able to find this serial rapist. Personally, I'd never seen a hit on such a big scale before. We were linking 30 cases by a single male DNA profile. But credit needs to be given to not just the laboratory. Every step along the way was what made this case so effective. Initially, much credit can be given to the victims. They took themselves to the police station, reported the crime, and had crime scene samples taken from their body as well as from the crime scene, even though they weren't able to identify the suspect. The district surgeons involved in the cases also have to be commended. They were able to take crime scene samples using rape kits very effectively from these victims and collect other evidence that was important. This evidence was then packaged correctly and sent to the investigating officer. Investigating officers in all of these cases were quite different from a range of police stations within Cape Town, and they can also be commended for their hard work and for their belief in the database that a suspect would eventually be arrested. The crime scene technicians can also be commended for their good work. They were able to extract male DNA from samples that definitely had a mixture of male and female DNA, as all of the victims were female. All of this work together resulted in very accurate results that were able to link 30 cases to each other. The Cape Town High Court was able to convict Mki on 84 cases. This was 30 cases of rape, 24 cases of kidnapping, 8 cases of assault, and 4 cases of grievous bodily harm. The DNA evidence pushed this case, and eventually the suspect pleaded guilty on all 84 charges. The court said that this was one of the worst cases they'd ever seen and one of the most heinous crimes they'd ever had to witness. The judge mentioned that victims suffered both physical and psychological effects from these crimes, and this helped her deal a very heavy sentence towards the suspect. Had there not been such overwhelming DNA evidence in this case, it would be very difficult to have given such a heavy sentence. In the end, he received 15 life sentences and 125 years in prison. It was because of DNA and good investigative work from start to finish and an effective database, that this criminal will be behind bars for the rest of his life. The community of Khayelitsha and Delft in Cape Town are a lot safer because of the effect of the database had on these cases.
Thanks, Philippa. As the world knows, South Africa has an atrocious sexual assault problem. It's encouraging to see how you and your colleagues in the South African Police Crime Lab are making a difference. Another case I often think about is the 1988 United Kingdom case that was submitted to the 2019 Hit of the Year program. In this case, a woman was raped during a home invasion where DNA was found. But being that it was 1988, the DNA was tested using RFLP technology and compared to a few suspects, but with no matches. In 2014, the United Kingdom reopened the case in hopes of solving it by using their highly successful DNA database that did not exist in 1988. However, the path to solving this case would bring the UK Crime Laboratory back to the foundations of where forensic DNA all started, inside Alec Jeffrey's laboratory. We are thrilled to have the forensic scientist that worked on this case with us here today. Catherine Turner is a forensic advisor on cold cases for Eurofins Forensic Services, which is the company providing the United Kingdom with its DNA testing service. Prior to joining Eurofins, Catherine was a cold case specialist with the UK's Forensic Science Service. Catherine, you had to go back into Alec Jeffrey's lab to solve this case. You obviously have the audience on edge of what that actually means. So please tell us about it.
Thanks, Tim, and thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this Zoom panel. And rather than leaving you on a cliff edge and moving on to those 30 years to 2014, I revisited this case as part of the Joint Police Review Team. And they were undertaking a large-scale project to forensically review all of their serious undetected sexual assaults from 1974 onwards. So in this particular case, in 2014, the only materials we had were 2 microscope slides, and these had been prepared from the original intimate swabs that were examined in 1988 during the examination for semen. So these slides are like mini biological time capsules. We can break open the seal, we can separate off the sperm cells from all the other cellular material, and we can subject our new DNA profiling techniques to those samples. However, having said that, in this particular case, our slides were really borderline in terms of whether or not we were going to get a result or not. So we took things very slowly and we staged it. We just tested one slide and even took that very, very slowly too. So from that testing, we obtained a low-level mixed DNA profile. However, we were able to derive a partial male profile from that, and we undertook a one-off special search of the DNA database, just the once, because we only had a few components to work with, and we restricted that search just to those local force areas. And not surprisingly, because it was a partial profile, we did get several matches to the database. However, there was one match in particular that was of interest because the particular individual, when the police researched him, he lived only 200 yards from where the victim lived at that time. He had other relevant previous convictions, and he matched the victim's description in terms of his age, his appearance, and even his local accent. So this was a really interesting lead in this case. However, the view was taken that the evidence so far, i.e. this bit of DNA that we'd got to get to this named individual, together with his antecedents, wasn't going to be enough for a successful prosecution at that time. So we got our heads together again. We had a few ideas about what to do next. And there were 2 main ideas, really. One was that we knew in the UK that we were developing some new DNA techniques, specifically some better YSTR profiling, more sensitive than we'd had before. And also we had the next phase of the autosomal DNA profiling, DNA 17, in the UK. Together with that, Eurofins was also developing some new software to help statistically evaluate mixtures. So all of this was a sort of exciting prospect, but we weren't quite there yet. So we parked the slides, we put them to one side, and we moved on to our other thought, which was, can we go back and resurrect the old DNA technique? So the RFLP technique, we still had the original results from this, was there any chance that we could find some way of recreating that laboratory? Well, I rang round lots of universities and eventually had some really helpful conversations with Leicester University, who still had some equipment and they were more than willing to help. So between us, we painstakingly rebuilt, tested, validated those original DNA processes. And amongst other things, we had to locate one of the original scientists from 30 years ago, who had samples taken from him as an internal control on all the RFLP plates that had ever been produced in the FSS. So it was vital that we had a sample from him so that we could ensure reproducibility of our own results if we got that far. As Tim said, it's really interesting to note that by coincidence, all of this new work and all this new research and resurrecting took place in the same laboratory that was used by Professor Sir Alec Jeffreys when he originally discovered the potential of DNA profiling in forensic science. So we basically come full circle. So this was where we had old technology meeting absolutely brand new technology. So it's really exciting for us to have all of this all in one case. But this research and validation process took about 2 years. And by the time we got that up and running, we'd also got up and running with all the current technology. So Eurofins had finished testing all their latest DNA technology. So we were basically good to go. So we had old technology lined up, new updated technology lined up, and we gave it a whirl. And of course, this has all taken place over a number of years. And so it's only in 2017, by this time, that police officers visited the victim, because it's policy in the UK not to visit the victim in these old cases unless we've actually got something positive to tell, unless we can say we think we've found who the perpetrator might be. She was by now living abroad, so that made things a bit complex. They updated her on the case, checked that she wanted to pursue a prosecution, took a new statement from her, provided support and care, took new reference samples, and a week later, the suspect was arrested and samples taken from him. The final forensic tests were then completed. And so in summary, we used 3 different types of DNA profiling systems in the case. We used autosomal STRs, DNA 17 in the UK. We used a more sophisticated and more sensitive YSTR profiling technique. And we used the resurrected RFLP technique in using the original results. And in each of those systems, we had partial profiles in each of those systems, and they matched the corresponding components in the suspect's reference samples. So this was amazing for us. This was great. So viewed collectively and together with the suspect's antecedents, i.e. where he lived, the fact that he was close to the scene, the right age, right geography, etc., all of those findings provided some really compelling evidence. The suspect pleaded guilty on the first day of his trial in November 2018 and was sentenced to nearly 10 years for rape and aggravated burglary. So the case was closed. And as I said, this was amazing for us, bringing together the very first DNA technology together with the very latest DNA technology.
Thank you, Catherine. What you and the Eurofins team did to solve this case is simply incredible. And it really does exemplify the creativity and problem-solving spirit that we so often see in the global forensic DNA community. Oh, and Catherine, I am not the only person to think what you did is amazing. I want to hand it over right now to a special guest.
Right, hi everybody, Alec Jeffreys here. Greetings from Leicester and from my retirement and from a little bit over a year of lockdown now, so I'm having a great time. Anyway, huge congratulations to Catherine Turner for going back to the old days of forensic DNA and resurrecting basically the dead and getting a great result, solving a case brilliantly done, well done. So let's wind the clock back to, I think the first DNA profiling systems we developed were in very late 1985 and went into casework in 1987. Associated with a language which has completely gone dead now. So back in those days we would be talking about southern blots and probes, oligo labeling, mini satellite probes like MS-1, MS-32, P-Lambda G3. We'll be doing our southern blots, our hybridization with PEG enhancement. I mean, all complete and utter gibberish. And that language has gone dead. Totally replaced by the language of PCR. I guess the switchover was roughly 1995 that we saw the end of a traditional DNA profiling or RFLP analysis. However, those old DNA profiles, they were important. They did establish the entire field of forensic DNA and really paved the way for later PCR applications to move very smoothly through courts. So we had some interesting tussles in those very early days, as I'm sure some of you will remember. Anyway, turning to this case, this was a huge challenge. Catherine was faced with the problem of basically resurrecting this ancient technology, went into my old laboratory at Leicester, and with the help of Celia May, who goes right back to those DNA profiling days, and my research assistant Rita Neumann, who knows everything about the field and about where all the probes were kept and everything, somehow they managed to resurrect the entire system. Quite a challenge, because this is basically a lost art that they had to rediscover. So I think this sort of forensic DNA archaeology is probably the best way of describing this case. But anyway, a phenomenally well done job. Congratulations, Catherine. I'm glad you enjoyed your time in my old lab, which actually hasn't changed all that dramatically since those days way back in the 1980s when the first forensic cases were being tackled. So brilliant bit of work, well done. And I'm really happy that this case and Catherine are being recognised by the DNA Hit of the Year programme. I think highlighting cases like this reminds the world just how DNA and forensic scientists are making our world a safer and more just place. So I hope you're all having a wonderful conference. It was a real pleasure for me to stop by and say hi to you all. So long for now, cheers, and back over to you, Tim.
Wow, Alec Jeffries, that was amazing. Thank you so much for joining us, Alec. Our next speaker, who participated as a 2017 DNA Hit of the Year judge, is Lorna Santos. Lorna has served as chief of the Philippines National Police DNA Unit. During her tenure, she has worked very hard to lead the effort within the Philippines National Police to expand their DNA laboratory and establish a national DNA database. I believe Lorna will be the first to tell you that she has enjoyed the international collaborations on both science and policy to give her ideas as she moved forward with putting the Philippines database together, including picking up some thoughts from the DNA Hit of the Year program. Lorna is going to talk about some of her experiences in developing the Philippines National Database and share a Hit of the Year case that has served as an inspiration to her as to what is possible when you have a world-class DNA database.
Thank you, Tim, for the introduction. It is very nice to be here today as part of the HIDS conference and participating in the 2021 DNA Hit of the Year program. In 2017, I was asked to serve as a judge for the first DNA Hit of the Year program. Who could forget that year? I don't think there will be another case like the Italian murder case of Yara Gambirasio again. What an incredible, dedicated DNA journey the police went through to solve this murder. I felt like I was reading a movie script with a drama at every turn. 2017 was also the year the judges reviewed the Chinese case known to the world as the Chinese Jack the Ripper, where 10 young women and 1 child died at the hands of a serial killer. This was the first major case that showed the global forensic community how YSTR database of criminal offenders are being used to identify suspects. A fascinating case that reminded us that there are so many strategies that can be used to harness the power of forensic DNA. These databases will allow us to solve crimes quickly, thereby removing dangerous criminals from the streets so they can't commit crimes again. Through these real cases, I can show to our leadership and to our Congress what is possible. Learning from forensic DNA programs in the countries that pioneered DNA databases is essential for developing countries like the Philippines. 10 years ago, we were learning about what was possible with DNA databasing from international visits from the people like Dr. Bruce Budole, Tim Shellberg, and many others. We used this information to work with the Philippine National Police leadership to develop the first phase of our DNA database program. We now have a high throughput capacity and have 60,000 samples in our database, just as a startup. As we move to the next phase of our database development, we need to convince our Congress to pass the DNA database legislation to fully authorize our DNA database policy and create sustainable funding. One case of the DNA Hit of the Year program that shows us what a world-class DNA program looks like is the sexual assault and murder of Heather Hoffman that occurred in Fort Collins, Colorado, USA in 2017. This exemplifies what is possible when you have a DNA program and an organization that moves fast. Within 1 day of finding Heather Hoffman's body, DNA was collected, tested, compared to the state DNA database, received a hit, and able to arrest the suspect that same day. Wow, I wish we could do that too. We are very fortunate today to have Detective Tammy Tracy, who is currently a training officer for the Fort Collins Police Department and served as forensic services detective at the time of this case. And also we have the lead detective in this case, Corporal Tessa Jacobson. She is 17-year police veteran and has spent much of her career in the crime against person unit with the Fort Collins, Colorado Police Department.
Thank you, Lorna. It is truly an honor to be a part of DNA Hit of the Year. The case that I'm going to talk about is a homicide case of Helena Hoffman that occurred in June of 2017. As a forensics detective at the time, I got the call that there was a body found floating in the lake. Upon recovering Helena's body, there were no obvious signs of trauma. And so at the time, we weren't quite sure if this was a suicide, an accident, or a homicide. But I saw what looked like some bruising around her neck. So I wanted to swab areas of her body for possible DNA collection. Her body has been in this bacteria-infested lake. The likelihood of us getting any DNA off of her was probably going to be pretty small. And so we swabbed her neck. Through the course of the autopsy, it was also found that she likely had suffered sexual assault. So both anal and vaginal swabs were taken as well. The coroner ruled Helena's death to be a homicide and the cause of death a drowning. We were not coming up with a lot of leads. We were able to get the DNA swabs and evidence to our lab the very next day, and we asked our lab if they would rush the case for us. During that time, we were able to establish a timeline of events for Helena, and we found out that her body was likely in the water for at least 13 hours. When we found that out, my heart sank. After 2 days, the lab called and said, we were able to develop a full DNA profile off of both the anal and vaginal swabs, as well as a YSTR profile from the swab on Helena's neck. And all three of those profiles matched the same unknown male offender. It was a good thing I was sitting down because I was shocked that not only were we able to get a full DNA profile, but that we were able to get a profile, a YSTR profile off of her skin after her body had been submerged in water for 13 hours. It was fantastic news because we finally had a viable lead. As we start to have some hope of, okay, we have somebody we're looking for, our lab immediately put that full profile into the National DNA Index system to be searched against other known offenders. 2 days later, we got the phone call that there was a match, and it matched a known sex offender who was first registered out of Kentucky. We finally had a name and we had a solid lead. As I was receiving the information from the lab, I was feeding it to the lead detective in the case, which is the next person that you're going to meet, Detective Tessa Jacobson. She was in charge of managing the entire case and seeing it from start to finish.
Thank you, Tammy. Tammy and I worked very closely together on this case. While the lab was processing the DNA swabs that were collected during autopsy, we were doing work trying to figure out more about Helena. We were speaking with her coworkers, ex-boyfriend, family members, roommates, and while we were speaking with all of those people, we were gathering DNA swabs and DNA samples from them. Once we learned that we had a male profile established, we sent all of those swabs down for comparison purposes. Unfortunately, we received the devastating news that none of those swabs was a match. These were the people that seemed like most likely suspects, as they were people that knew Helena and had spent time with her recently before her death. At that point, we were realizing that we had a case with an unknown suspect who is still out on the loose and could potentially be a danger to other people in our community. Thankfully, about a day after receiving the information that none of our initial suspects had come back as a match, we received that DNA profile hit for the suspect out of Kentucky who had recently moved to our area. The amazing thing about this was that without that DNA information, without that hit, that suspect had not been on our radar at all as a potential suspect for the case. He did not know Helena and was a complete stranger to her until that night. The information that we received from the lab and the quick turnaround time that we received from them helped us to locate him, arrest him, and ensure that he wasn't able to harm anyone else in our community. This also gave Helena's family some peace of mind knowing that they were able to finally know who had done this to their daughter, and also to help them kind of put some of the pieces together about what had happened to her.
Thank you, Lorna, and thank you, Tammy and Tessa. You are very fortunate to work in a department and state that makes solving crime with DNA a top priority. Not only does Colorado invest in having the DNA technology and people in place that can identify a suspect in 2 days, but they also have extremely strong DNA database legislation. By requiring all arrested and convicted felons to go into the database, Colorado's crime scene to offender database hit rate is closing in on 50%. While 48 hours is impressive to identify a criminal with DNA, consider where the world is headed with rapid DNA. With all the excitement we are now seeing with police agencies actively pursuing rapid DNA, we are not too far off when solving a case like this in 2 days or even less will be a common occurrence everywhere. This concludes our 2021 DNA Hit of the Year program. I want to offer a major thank you to our incredible panel. And also, of course, a big shout out to Thermo Fisher Scientific for sponsoring the DNA Hit of the Year. We simply could not offer this program without your generous support. The DNA Hit of the Year is looking forward to going back to our normal routine in 2022, when we will receive new cases, have them reviewed by an international panel of judges, and select the next DNA Hit of the Year. So please be on the lookout for the call for submission in early January. It's been an amazing HIDS conference. Thank you for coming, and so long until next year.